There was a pretty strong thunderstorm happening that night. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make everyone stay indoors for the rest of the day. I'm one of those people who actually enjoy rainy nights or even storms. Something about it just feels cozy and calming to me. Whenever nights like this happened, I would always spend them on the couch watching TV and listening to the rain. Fortunately, I didn't have work the next day, and since it was already 8 p.m., I made myself a hot cup of coffee and decided to stay up as late as I wanted to enjoy the cozy atmosphere. I sat down and turned on a movie. It was only about 20 minutes into the movie when my phone began ringing. I picked it up and checked the number, but I didn't recognize it. The area code, however, was from my city. I answered just in case, always thinking it could be something important or maybe someone I knew but hadn't saved their number. Hello? No one said anything. Can I help you? Hello? Still, there was no response. Oddly enough, I could tell the line wasn't dead. I could hear some background noise. It was faint and messy, and after a few seconds of thinking, it sounded like the storm or the rain outside. So I knew someone was definitely there, just not speaking. Feeling a bit uneasy, I hung up. I couldn't really think of any reason someone would call and say nothing. I figured it must have been a mistake or some kind of scam, though it wasn't like the usual robot calls. I tossed my phone back on the end table and went back to watching TV. I was well into the movie, probably an hour in, when all of a sudden the storm outside became way louder, like it seriously picked up, thunder, lightning, and heavy rain all at once. Then the TV and lights flickered. They quickly turned off and came right back on in less than a second. I paused the movie and glanced around, not sure what was going on. Then not even 30 seconds later, the power went out completely. Suddenly, the whole house was silent, and the storm outside sounded twice as loud. Rain was pounding on the roof and against the windows, and the thunder kept rolling non-stop for what felt like 5 minutes straight. The only light I had was a small candle I rarely used. Of course, I had my phone, but I didn't want to use up its battery since I wasn't sure how long this would last. I lit the candle, then decided to check the breaker box downstairs. I went down and saw the switch was loose. I flipped it back and forth a few times, but it was totally dead. I headed back upstairs and realized there was really nothing to do except watch the storm through the window. I noticed all the other houses on the street were dark as well, so it seemed like the outage was affecting the whole area. My phone was running on 5G data, so I checked for any updates on the situation, but there was nothing posted. I was probably standing at the window for around 15 minutes just watching and listening to the storm when all of a sudden I heard something outside the house. I knew the sound instantly. It was the gate to my backyard swinging open. That gate didn't have any kind of lock, but it never just swings open by itself. Not sure what to think, I walked to the back of the house and looked out the back door. Even through the dark and the storm, I could see the shadow of a man. He had clearly come from the side where the gate was, but now he was just standing out in the rain, right in the middle of the backyard. Since I could only make out his outline, he just looked like a dark shape. I couldn't tell where he was facing. Was he looking towards the house at me or away from it? I had no idea what he was doing out there, but it made me feel uneasy. I knew I could open the door and yell at him to get off my property, but I felt too nervous. I mean, if he was wandering around in a massive storm like this, who's to say he didn't have a gun or something worse? I decided not to confront him and just stayed by the door to keep an eye on him. He didn't move at all for an entire minute until his arm slowly lifted out from his pocket and he brought his hand up to his head. I wasn't sure what he was doing, but I noticed a small glowing light in his hand. Just as I realized what it was, my phone started ringing in the other room. It only took me a couple of seconds to understand what was happening. This guy outside my house was calling me. That explained why I heard rain on the call earlier when no one spoke. But that had been an hour ago. Had he been standing out there in the storm this entire time? Feeling panicked, I ran to the living room and grabbed my phone, confirming it was the same number. Without answering it, I hurried back to the door. But the man was gone. That freaked me out even more. Why hadn't I just stayed by the door and watched him? I felt so stupid. I didn't want to stay by the door anymore, knowing he could be watching me from somewhere I couldn't see. I went back to the living room. I thought about calling the police, but what could I even tell them? Someone had called me twice and was standing in my backyard, but I had no proof it was the same person or that they were doing anything illegal. Not long after that, my phone rang again. I jumped, even though I half expected it. That's how shaken I was. I declined the call, and only seconds later there was a loud knock at the front door. They kept calling while knocking on the door. These were heavy, forceful knocks that made the walls shake. I turned my phone on silent, and embarrassingly, I froze up and didn't move. I know how bad that sounds, but I've never been in a situation like this before, and the storm and power outage just made it worse. I think it took about 30 seconds, and them hitting the door even harder before I snapped out of it and finally called the police. My hands were trembling as I held the phone. They told me an officer was on the way and was only about 4 minutes from my house. I kept them updated on what was happening while the man outside kept pounding on the door. This went on the whole time while I waited for the police to arrive. At last, the operator told me they were on my street. Moments later, I heard someone shouting. I ran to the window and saw the officer chasing the man. They ran off into the storm, and I couldn't see anything after that. I think I waited about 2 minutes before the officer returned empty-handed. The guy had gotten away. I was actually surprised by how seriously the police took the situation. They did a pretty solid investigation and seemed to really care. Probably because they had actually seen the guy and tried to catch him. But the only lead they had was the phone number, and that turned out to be useless. I tried thinking of anyone who might hold a grudge against me or want to scare me like this, but I couldn't come up with anyone. The case eventually faded away, and since then I haven't gotten any more calls from that number or seen anything strange again.